Welcome to this class, Introduction to the Philosophy of Economics. And now I would like to tell you what the content is. So I give you and explain shortly the outline. So we start with a section, what is philosophy of economics? Because many of you will not have an idea what philosophy of economics is all about. Then in the second section, I will talk about general philosophies of science and economics. So they are independently of economics, they are general philosophies of science, and the question is what their bearing is on economics. Then we will talk about a very specific topic, the foundations of microeconomics. Then we'll talk about a certain kind of foundations of macroeconomics, namely the question whether macroeconomics has to be or is anchored in microeconomics. It's called micro foundations of macroeconomics. Then the fifth section will deal with a classic, most important methodological paper, post-war economics. It's Friedman's The Methodology of Positive Economics from 1953. It's still much discussed. It's an actual topical paper. Then we'll talk about models in economics. You know that models are very important in economics. So economics has been characterized even as the science of models. Then we'll talk about new branches of economics, controversial branches, behavioral economics first, then experimental economics, and then neuroeconomics, the most controversial one of these three new branches of economics. Now we start with section 1, what is philosophy of economics? And the outline will be this. I'll say a few words about the literature, and then I make some general introductory remarks, and then I give you an overview over the philosophy of economics, namely the different topics, the different things that are dealt with in this special case of philosophy, and then I come to a conclusion. So the literature that is relevant here is a central text, and I'm using the material, not all of it, but some of it, of this article by Daniel Hausman, one of the leading philosophers of economics. It's an article called Philosophy of Economics, and it's in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. That's an internet encyclopedia. It's well known, it's of extremely high quality. So whenever you have to look up something in the philosophy in general, then this is certainly a good starting point. These are long articles, much material, also much literature. And in that particular case, this is, so to speak, the standard review article of philosophy of economics. Then you find selected literature on philosophy of economics on the syllabus. See the last page. There you have many more items which you can consult in case you want to.
Now I start with general introductory remarks, which seem to be possibly welcome by you, because some of you, at least this is my experience with that class, some people come here and have no idea what philosophy is and don't know what philosophy of economics is. And I say a few words about that you get a very rough idea what's expecting you there and make some distinctions, and then we'll very quickly go into topics where you see then exemplars of what I'm discussing here now very abstractly. Now, first of all, one should distinguish something which is called general philosophy of science versus philosophy or methodology of economics. You will find both terms, philosophy of economics, also methodology of economics. People use it not with very sharp boundaries. Some people try to make a distinction between methodology and philosophy of economics. Well, these are words which may be useful or they may be useless. First of all, let's make this bigger distinction between a general philosophy of science and something more particular tuned towards economics. Now, general philosophy of science deals with general features of all sciences. You may have heard in the course of your studies names like Thomas Kuhn, Karl Popper, Imre Lakatos. These are people that work in general philosophy of science, and I will come back to them, to all three of them, and they deal with general features of all sciences. For instance, how do the sciences explain? And the idea behind that is, of course, there is a general pattern of scientific explanation, and general philosophy of science tries to find it out. This is not a trivial affair, you know, it doesn't have to be like that. It could be that all the sciences explain differently, but the assumption here is that there are general patterns or general patterns, for instance, in explanations of science. Or, how are scientific theories tested? I mean, there is again the assumption that there are scientific theories in many different fields, different areas, different disciplines, and the point is they have to be somehow tested. They don't have to be arbitrary, right? You don't simply speculate and say anything in science, but you should somehow test that. And the question is, are there general patterns of testing general theories, or more particular theories perhaps, scientific theories in general? Or, what does scientific progress consist in precisely? It's one of the fundamental aspects of science, at least for the last 400 years, that science is an enterprise that shows progress. And it's not clear in many other domains of life whether they show progress or not. If you look at the arts, for instance, it's not clear whether the arts make progress. Or if you look at the world situation, does it make progress for the last 300 years? Yes, some people say yes, some people say no. There's also regress. So it's not quite clear. There are many areas in which we don't have progress. So we do have progress, for instance, especially in the Western, or not Western, but industrialized countries, concerning the health system. So everywhere life expectancy increases. Well, sometimes there are also decreases, but in general we can say yes, there with the health system we seem to be dealing with that fairly well. There is a general progress. But as I said, this is not to be taken simply for granted, and especially the interesting question then is what is this scientific progress precisely? What does it consist in? Can we describe that more carefully? And you will see that there are controversies about that, for instance. And more on that later in section 2, in which I talk then about economics and this general philosophy of science. I will present there these main main positions that are interesting for you because they appear here and there in the economic literature. And so if you read something about Kuhn or Lakatos or Popper, for instance, you should know a little about that. And this is what I'm going to teach you. And also I'm trying to explain to you how these positions were applied to economics and what the fate of these applications was. Because that's interesting, because it's not clear whether that general stuff, well, I mean, they say it's general. I mean, how general is it really? Well, we'll see. Is it general enough to be applied to economics? Controversial question. We'll discuss it. All right. So, this was the first distinction between this general philosophy of science and this, so to speak, particular or specialized philosophy of economics. And you see the focus is just different, and we'll see how much the two will interrelate or interlock. Whatever, we'll find that out. And now the second thing, the philosophy methodology of economics, that deals with questions that are specific for economics, as you can expect. So for instance, how do abstract, unrealistic economic models explain? This is fairly specific for economics. Sociologists also use very abstract models, and some other disciplines, also in physics, you find extremely abstract models. But if you concentrate on these specific economic models, the question is really, how do they deliver their explanatory load, so to speak, to economics? And some of them are really abstract. I mean, chips on a checkerboard, right? And you play around with them, and then you say, this explains segregation in American cities. And you've got to say, wait a minute, how does that work, right? This is what we want to understand there. So, for instance, abstract, unrealistic economic models, or, for instance, also an interesting fact, and that is something which I have not seen in other disciplines. Why do economists use normative models in descriptive theories? So this is really funny that you use, as you know, in microeconomics, you sometimes assume that the actors involved in some sort of economic process, that they are rational agents. This is a normative theory, the rationality theory of rationality that's used in economics, but you use it not in order to inform these agents, please be a little more rational. You don't do that, but you use that as a description of what the agents do. So you simply assume a normative theory to be descriptively valid for certain models. And the question is, how is that justified? I mean, how does that work? And that's, as I said, that's very specific for economics, that you use these rational models of action and build them into models and larger theories, even in which you assume that the act somehow assume, the question is what sort of assumption is that, somehow assume, whatever that means, that the agents behave rationally. We'll see that is a central topic also in Friedman's 53 paper, and we'll discuss it there in great detail. People have very different views how these, within economics, how these assumptions, certain normative assumptions, work within models, and there's a long discussion about that, and we will join this discussion and look what's going on. Or, for instance, I mentioned it already, what's the relation between micro and macroeconomics, which is, at least from the macroeconomist side, sometimes a quite controversial discussion. Microeconomists very often don't really care very much about it and simply assume, well, I mean, the stuff at the micro level determines what happens at the macro level. Let the macro people do there and analyze that. But the macro level, macro people are sometimes ambitious of stressing some sort of autonomy of macroeconomics. And the question is, how does that work as an argument? How are the arguments, and what sort of autonomy would be appropriate to claim for macroeconomics? That is highly controversial among economists and philosophers of economics, and it's an interesting topic because it's a special case of something that happens in many, many other disciplines. So you find that in physics, you find that in biology, you find that in sociology, you find that, well, chemistry, that you have some sort of aggregate level, things at the aggregate level, they're aggregates of something, and you have a lower level of their components and parts, and then you try to understand what's happening at the level of the parts, and you try to understand what's happening at the level of the aggregates, and then the question is, how do these two levels relate? So what sort of relation is there? And that you have in sociology, as well as you have it within physics, between chemistry and physics, and so on. So this is a very general problem, the problem of reduction and emergence, and this is an application case, so perhaps one can also learn something from the discussion in the other disciplines if you transfer that to the realm of economics and then discuss the questions of macroeconomics and microeconomics. This is what we are going to do in one of the chapters. All right. So I should also tell you something about my understanding of philosophy. This may sound very odd to you because you probably never have a class in which, in economics, where the lecturer at the beginning says, I'm telling you now my understanding of economics, right? That would be ridiculous. Or my understanding of physics or chemistry, because there's a sort of rough consensus of what that is. And that is different in philosophy. In philosophy, you don't find a consensus, and therefore I tell you what I'm trying to do here. So for me, one of the very important aspects of philosophy is that one questions things that are usually taken for granted. So for instance, the example there, economists use models for explanatory purposes. They somehow know how to do it. I'm not supposing they're making any big mistakes there, but they somehow know it. Well, sometimes it doesn't work that nicely. If you look at the financial crisis, models, it's a little difficult, but the economists don't need philosophers to tell them that. But the question is simply that the economists probably know what they are doing, but the question is that you can say, wait a minute, but I want to understand that a little better. And this is exactly what then philosophy economics is, that you say, I don't question this practice, I just want to understand how it works. And sometimes the practicing economists don't give you the very best answers. They just know how to do it. But when you ask them, how are you doing it? Well, I'm just applying the model, you see. So this is something where philosophy of economics may come in. Then trying to understand, this is a sort of different way of putting that, trying to understand what is going on. I mean, in some sense, all the sciences do that, making things as explicit as possible. There are many cases in which in the sciences there is a certain practice and it works, and all those people who know this practice and are good at it, they know what they are doing. But they're not explicitly telling you what they are doing. And if you want to understand this practice a little better and deeper perhaps, then you must make things explicit that are taken for granted by the practitioners. And that's very general in philosophy, that you say things in a practice that are taken for granted for good reasons. It's not a criticism, but just saying, yeah, but I want to understand that a little better, and then you must make things explicit. They are implicitly assumed. And then you say, okay, let's bring that to light, make it explicit. Okay? Then the point is that this sort of exercise, what philosophy is, may or may not be useful for the questioned areas. This is just very clear. And I tell you here what, for instance, Richard Feynman, a physicist, Nobel in 1965, an important physicist and a good Nobel Prize, not an average Nobel Prize, a very good Nobel Prize, really. Philosophy of science is about as useful to scientists as ornithology is to birds. Right? Ornithology is the science of birds. So what he says is that if you look at the practice of physics, and if you look whether philosophy of physics has ever been useful for this practice of physics, at least since Second World War, someone else said, another Nobel Prize winner, Weinberg, they say no. There was no significant influence of philosophy of physics on physics, so it's pretty useless. Now, the point is that there are certain areas also in physics today in which indeed philosophers of physics and physicists cooperate. But they are very small comparatively to the whole of physics. And the same holds for economics. There are, and the same, by the way, also for biology, for instance, also in the social sciences. But usually they are very small. And the influence then of philosophy on these disciplines is very small. And probably most economists are extremely skeptical of all this philosophical nonsense. And say, no experiments, no data, they're just talking, right? So you may have these prejudices or assumptions yourself. The point simply, what I want to say at this point is, usefulness is not everything. So if you criticize, or someone criticizes and says, well, philosophy of science is not useful, then one possible response is, that may be right. It may not improve your science itself, but if you are interested in understanding what your science is doing, then you better turn to philosophy of science. So all I'm saying is, usefulness is not everything, and you won't really improve your practice usually by doing philosophy, but you may get some insight, and you may get, in the best case, a better understanding what that science is all about and how certain things function. Sometimes it may improve scientific practice. I have for many years, I have taught at the University of Hanover, International Horticulture Science. Horticulture, Gartenbau. Horticulture science. There were students, graduate students from all over the world, and the professors there had decided they should have a class on theories and methods of research. And I thought, well, if they want me to teach that, I try to do my best. Whether it helps them, I have no idea. And quite to my surprise then, some of the supervisors of master theses, they told me that they had the impression that these people learned something from this class on theories and methods of research. As a critical philosopher of science, I would say, I would love to see the empirical investigation, measuring this effect, you should have then randomized, random controlled study, and they didn't have that. But they had the feeling that it was useful. Okay, that helped me, it was great. So it may be that one can learn something for the practice of a science by doing philosophy or methodology of that science, but don't expect too much for it. If you say, I'm here, well, for technical reasons, getting ECTS points and so, that's fine. But if you are even out of interest here, then you should rather expect, in the best case, to get some insight in the function of economics and certain aspects you are not aware of, but don't expect too much that your grades in the rest of economics will go up and rocket, 6 and A+++ all the time. Don't expect that. All right. If you get it, it's fine with me. I don't mind it, but I'm not selling this class in that way. All right. So this was the second remark about philosophy of economics, or methodology in economics. And the final remark, I mentioned it already, and that is important because it's different. Well, it's not completely different from economics, but it is even more radical in philosophy. In philosophy in general, and also in philosophy of economics, everything is controversial. There's practically no consensus on anything in philosophy of economics and in philosophy in general. practically nothing. That is, of course, if one looks as you have done, because you're on the master's level, you've seen that how many controversies are in economics, but it's even much, much worse in philosophy, and philosophy exists longer than economics, 2,500 years, and there were temporal consensus, but they didn't last very long, then they decayed. So there is just no consensus. Everything is controversial, and that's the question then, how can one, in a somehow justified way, teach something like that? Why I can't tell you, this is the truth, and this is the truth, and that is the truth, and there's a consensus if everything is controversial. So no one can speak with absolute authority here, no one, me of course included. And in my presentation of the views of others, I try to be as objective as possible. This is what I'm doing. So I'm not trying to sell you my views, because this is for your further career less important than, if it's important at all, or for your interest, but you should see what's happening in philosophy of economics, what is going on there, and it's much less interesting to see what I seem to think about it. If there were another lecturer, you would get a different view. So it's pure accident that I'm standing here, because I teach this class. So don't take my opinions very seriously. My analysis and criticism, yes, but not my opinions. My own views will partly be visible in my criticism of others, and they are, of course, up for discussion. If you think you disagree with that, what I'm saying, then please ask me and object. All right, and on the slides, a notational note, things in square brackets are my additions. So when I discuss a paper and then you find the square brackets, then this is Hoyningen and it's not the author.
Now I would like to give you an outline of this section 1 that is entitled An Overview over the Philosophy of Economics, such that you can see how this material is structured. First, I'll give you some historical information, the main development of economics of the last centuries. Then the next will be what is mainstream economics today, and then I'll come to challenges to and extensions of mainstream economics, and this will concern developments in the last decades. And finally, I will come to perspectives on economics from outside, where you have a certain viewpoint, say general philosophy of science, and then you look at economics. Now, I must stress all of that will be very schematic. The idea is really that you get an overview, and of course I have to skip over many, many details, and in a sense it's very superficial what I'm telling you, but in order to get the first overview, I think and hope that this is useful. Okay.